Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk for like a minute and a half, and then I'm going to introduce Nishad, who's the actual speaker. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Orin Herskowitz. I run a group at Columbia called Columbia Technology Ventures. Our role is to help when the faculty and graduate students come up with new innovations, new deep tech innovations that might have an impact on society. Our role is to help get those inventions, and then we get around 400 of those a year from across the university, to match those up with industry and venture capital and entrepreneurs to help get those companies started. And that happens, we end up launching about 25 to 30 deep tech startups a year. These days, about a quarter of those are climate related. It's been really exciting to see the growth of climate as a sector. We've been sitting on these inventions for a long time, but the venture capital marketplace finally came around and is now investing in them, which is great. So what we're finding is a lot of our companies like Green Ore, which does the steel waste chain, Trident, wastewater desalination. We've got a couple of different startups doing fashion tech, so making the fashion economy more green, like Wearwool and Alginate. Kelvin, which does residential tech. Stillbright for mining, XL batteries, which is not surprisingly for batteries, and Heirloom, which we love talking about because it's such a great example of what can happen when these innovative university technologies get the right kind of funding, get the right kind of entrepreneurs in place, and take off like a rocket. And so I'm gonna ask, what Nishad's gonna talk about today is, that's all awesome. We celebrate when we launch these startups and they get paired with venture capitalists and great entrepreneurs, and we sort of like wash our hands and say mission accomplished. But that's unfortunately only the beginning of a really perilous and challenging and exciting journey to get these technologies out into the real world. And so what we've asked Nishad to talk about is, how does it feel to be in that rocket ship? And does it, like, what are the daily things that you encounter? So Nishad's gonna be talking about that. One last request to everybody, and I've asked Nishad to talk about this too. I'm actually, for the last couple of years, our office has been working on standardizing the agreements between the universities and venture capitalists negotiate when they try to launch a startup out of a university. And we've been working with our peers at MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Berkeley, Caltech, and others, and a bunch of great VCs around the world to come up with standardized terms. We just finished that for the climate industry, and that'll be released next week with the National Venture Capital Association and Autumn, our industry website, industry association. But the White House has asked me and some of my peers to come down next week and meet with DOE and NSF to say, great, job well done. What else can the federal government do to remove roadblocks for these innovations getting to market? So I'm crowdsourcing this today. I'll be here all day. This is what I look like. Find me on a break. I'm interested in your ideas because we've got 45 minutes with the head of the NSF, DOE, and the White House to give them ideas. So come find me. And I asked Nishad to throw out a couple of examples during his talk. So everyone, please welcome Nishad from Heirloom.
All right. Thank you very much, Orin. Thrilled to be here to talk about Heirloom and high durability carbon removal. To answer Orin's question about the rocket ship, it rattles a lot. So hopefully I can share some of why it rattles. But just really quickly about myself, I'm Nishad Pai. I lead business development and partnerships at Heirloom. What does that really mean? Well, I basically work on all of the partnerships on both the supply side and the demand side of our business. So think about supply side as all the partnerships that we need to do in order to pull carbon dioxide out of the air. And so that would be things like renewable energy, transport and storage, measurement, reporting, and verification. And then on the supply side, we take the environmental attributes of the carbon removals that we make, and we sell them to companies who are looking to abate their emissions. I've been at Heirloom for a little bit over a year now, and I spent the better part of 25 years in technology and media leading various teams at companies like Adobe, Google, and Amazon, which happen to be some of the biggest buyers in the voluntary carbon removal market. So no coincidence there. But prior to that, I spent several years in investment banking, and I'm a chemical engineer by education. So I have an admission to make. I have been accused of being a serial acronym abuser. And so in order to ground you all in some of the things I want to be flinging around today, here's a little bit of a key. So when I talk about DAC, I'm referring specifically to direct air capture. CDR is carbon dioxide removal. IPCC is, I'm not really sure, but You can see it up here, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. CCS is carbon capture and storage, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff like DOE, we talked about, Department of Energy, CO2, carbon dioxide, but be forewarned. Okay, so two things need to happen in order to meet climate goals, right? Number one, we have to reduce new emissions, and number two, we have to remove atmospheric CO2. Even if we stop all new emissions today, we still have to remove the CO2 that's been collecting in the atmosphere for the last 150 years. Atmospheric CO2 concentrations have actually increased from 280 parts per million to over 425 parts per million since pre-industrial times. And that's over a 50% increase, so we need to bring those levels down. So an heirloom is a precious object that is passed from generation to generation. Earth is our most important heirloom. That's where our name comes from. Heirloom's mission is to leverage the natural power of limestone to remove billions of tons of CO2 using the world's most cost-effective direct air capture technology. Why billions of tons? Because the IPCC estimates that we're going to need to remove 6 to 10 billion tons per year of CO2 from the atmosphere by 2035 in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So Heirloom, we just celebrated our 4th birthday. We were founded in March of 2020. We're based in Brisbane, California, just south of San Francisco, between SFO and San Francisco. We've raised over $50 million in venture capital, and we have over 150 employees. So even though the company is only 4 years old, the research within direct air capture and carbon mineralization, which is our technology, has been going on for the better part of 25 years. So our technology actually comes out of university, Orin alluded to. It comes out of 4 universities. University of Pennsylvania, this university, Columbia, and also University of British Columbia and Heriot-Watt University out of Scotland. So our CEO and co-founder, Shashank Samala, identified these 4 universities as doing varying degrees of research within direct air capture and carbon mineralization and pulled them all together. Our scientific co-founder, Dr. Noah McQueen, who you see there on the bottom left, completed his PhD in chemical engineering at UPenn, and his focus was in direct air capture and carbon mineralization. He came out of the lab of Dr. Jennifer Wilcox, who's now the Assistant Secretary of Energy in the Biden administration. So Heirloom has raised capital from some of the biggest investors in climate. Our lead investors are Breakthrough Energy, which is Bill Gates' firm, Aaron Capital, Carbon Direct, and then we also have investments from Microsoft, Prelude Ventures, and Lower Carbon Capital. We've also received funding from the US government through grants from ARPA-E and the National Science Foundation. So Heirloom has taken a first principles approach to high durability carbon dioxide removal. So what that means is that these principles are at the center of everything that we do, whether it's in R&D, engineering, or in commercialization, which is the organization that I'm in. So what do these things mean? Permanence. Our CDR must be stored and sequestered for more than 1,000 years. Scalability. We talked about removing 6 to 10 billion tons of CO2 by 2050. So we need technologies that can scale quickly. That's really not that much time. Our CDR must be measurable, meaning that it has to be quantifiable from capture of the CO2 from the air to storage and sequestration. We have to instill confidence, trust, and credibility in the ecosystem in order for our carbon removals to be considered legitimate. Additionality effectively means that if not for the deployment of our facilities, would the carbon dioxide be removed? And the answer is no. Community-centered. We have to take into account the needs of the communities around which we're deploying our technologies. And that doesn't only mean from a training, education, good paying job standpoint. It also takes into account things like childcare and early childhood education. We take that very, very seriously. And then finally, safety. We're in the business of taking CO2 out of the air, not in the business of putting it back in. and we certainly don't want to put any other materials back into the environment that's going to harm it. So there's many different pathways to removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. There's things like reforestation and afforestation, biomass plus CCS, soil carbon, enhanced rock weathering, carbon mineralization, ocean alkalinity, direct air capture. And all of these pathways have their pros and cons. Heirloom has taken two of these pathways, direct air capture and carbon mineralization, and we've combined those. And the effect of that is that we basically remove all of the cons from each of these pathways, and we preserve all of the benefits. So every good strategy, I'm sure there's a lot of B school students here, has a pretty flywheel, right? And our flywheel, so our flywheel basically starts with technology that drives offtakes, that's purchases of carbon credits, drives financing, drives deployment, drives scale. All of this to achieve gigaton scale. So while this looks simple, and just referencing what Orin was talking about, it's not that simple, right? It's not without its challenges. In fact, we have a nickname for our flywheel here. It's called the virtuous gauntlet, because every step of this flywheel has its challenges, starting with the technology. How do you effectively remove carbon dioxide from the air and permanently store it at gigaton scale? That's no small problem, right? Offtake. Why would Fortune 500 companies purchase carbon credits from a startup supplier? How does an early stage, non-credit worthy company like Heirloom access capital? What does it take to build a direct air capture facility? There's construction involved here, right? And then finally, how many deployments do you have to make in order to be able to cut and paste and sort of rinse and repeat these facilities and these plants? So we use rocks to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, limestone in particular. Limestone is abundant and accessible. It makes up 4% of the Earth's crust. It's the second most mined material on Earth. It's the principal ingredient in concrete, so all of us are walking on limestone, presumably, every day. And limestone is a natural sorbent for CO2 in nature. But it takes months, if not years, for limestone to fully saturate with CO2. What our technology and our process has done is it's actually reduced that to 3 days. And limestone is, it's a fairly simple formula. It's calcium carbonate for our chemistry and chemical engineering friends out there. It's made up of carbon dioxide and lime, basically, calcium oxide. Okay, so how does our process work? We basically take limestone, we put it in a kiln, we superheat it, and two reactions happen. One is that a near pure stream of CO2 comes out, and then the other byproduct is lime, calcium oxide. So we take the calcium oxide, we put it on a tray, we hydrate it, it turns into something called calcium hydroxide. We stack those trays up into the air, expose it to the atmosphere, and that material is thirsty for CO2. And it absorbs the CO2 and turns back over a 2.5 to 3 day period, and it turns back into limestone. So it's a very efficient process because now we can take the limestone again and we can loop it through the process. We've tested this looping up to 30 times without any degradation to the material. We think that we can go much higher than that, but 30 times is enough for us to get to a billion-ton scale. So what do we do with the CO2? CO2 can be permanently stored in a number of different ways. Our preferred method of storing CO2 is in EPA Class 6 wells. The only issue is that there are not any EPA Class 6 wells that are online today. Those Class 6 wells, the earliest ones are scheduled to come online in Q2 of 2025. So that's not really an option for us right now. CO2 can be permanently sequestered in geologic formations like basalt through partners like CarbFix. And CO2 can also be permanently sequestered in materials utilization and production. So since those first two methods are limited or not really available yet, Heirloom had to literally innovate a way to permanently sequester our CO2 in concrete. We actually did that with a company called Carbon Cure, and we became the first company to permanently store atmospheric CO2 in concrete, meaning that once the concrete is broken down, the CO2 will not be released back into the atmosphere. So not only do we have to remove billions of tons of CO2 from the atmosphere per year, but we need to do it affordably. Numerous research reports have identified $300 per ton as the price at which demand scales significantly. So our goal is to bring the cost, and I think Baron had mentioned this in terms of $100 per ton, is to bring the cost down to about that level. And so how are we going to do that, right? We're going to do that through our inputs. As I mentioned, limestone is accessible and it's cheap. We can loop it through our process many times, which makes it even cheaper. Modularity. We develop all of our subsystems independently of each other so that we can actually mass manufacture the components and then deploy and scale quickly. And then finally, we learn from every ton. Even though the hardware in our system does the heavy lifting, the software is really the brains of the operation, and we really haven't even started scratching the surface with respect to artificial intelligence and machine learning. So the more efficient that we can make our process, obviously the lower the cost. Okay, so offtake, and I assume people know what offtake means, but this is basically taking the environmental attributes of our carbon dioxide removals and selling them to companies who are looking to abate their emissions. It's an incredibly important part of the virtuous gauntlet. The reason is because it generates revenue. It basically sends really strong demand signals to the market, and it allows us to raise capital, both venture capital and also project capital. Currently, we're predominantly in a voluntary buying market, but we believe that compliance markets are going to become much more prevalent in the coming years. Compliance markets is basically law and legislation. This is all happening, at the state level here in the United States. California is leading with some of the requirements for companies to abate their emissions. The federal government has all kinds of different programs right now. I'll talk about regional DAC hubs here in a second, but the Department of Energy is actually procuring high durability carbon removals, direct air capture in particular, for its own account. And so there's ETS developments in EU, there's ETS developments in Japan and in Canada. So by 2030, we believe the compliance markets are going to be pretty well formed. So we closed the largest deal in high durability carbon dioxide removal with Microsoft to remove up to 315,000 metric tons of CO2 over a 10+ year period. So beyond the size of that deal, the most important feature of it is that it was the first bankable deal in direct air capture. So that allowed us to actually go and secure project capital to deploy our first scaled commercial facility, which is in process right now. So back to the question from our virtuous gauntlet. So why would a Fortune 500 company want to buy carbon removals from a startup like Heirloom? So the first answer is that many of these large companies publish their sustainability goals. In the case of Microsoft, their goal is to basically achieve net zero by 2030, but they are going one step further. They want to remove all emissions that they've ever made since their founding in 1975 by 2050, okay? So, the other reason is that there's a general acknowledgement that there's going to be supply constraints for high durability CDR once you hit 2035 and beyond timeframe. So companies are willing to pay higher prices for lower volumes today for the promise of access to higher volumes at lower prices down the road. Okay, So there's three primary ways to finance deployments. One is venture capital, one is public capital, and one is private capital, right? Venture capital is a very, very expensive way to finance deployments. Oh, sorry, am I getting the music? All right, let me keep going. All right, so venture capital is very expensive to finance deployments. So we want to keep that to a minimum for our overall financing strategy. Private project finance can be tricky for early stage companies because they lack creditworthiness. And public project finance actually complements private finance by doing things like matching funds dollar for dollar. In fact, Heirloom and our partners actually were awarded one of 2 regional DAC hubs from the Department of Energy that gave us access to up to $600 million in matching funding. Okay, so we're often asked the question, why do we believe that we can reach 1 billion tons by 2035? Well, we've gone from removing kilograms of CO2 to a kiloton of CO2 in the matter of 27 months. We've learned something new from every deployment that we've made. And what you're seeing here on the left, on your left, is our R&D facility at our headquarters in Brisbane, California. That is called a contactor. A contactor consists of 2 towers of these stacked trays, and in between them is something called a distributor, which is a robot. Think about it as an elevator that goes up and down the tower. It pulls trays on a periodic basis. It measures attributes of those trays. It treats them if necessary, and then it goes and puts them back on the shelf. And then after 2.5 to 3 days, it pulls the shelves, empties them, fills them again, and then puts them back up to go and start carbonating again. And then I had mentioned a little bit earlier, we launched America's first commercial direct air capture facility. So that facility consists of 24 of those contactors that you just saw, so 48 towers. The previous facility that's at our headquarters removed 100 tons of CO2 per year. This facility actually removes 1,000 tons of CO2 per year. And so think about that. It's not a lot, but think about the scale. So every time we deploy a new facility, we're increasing the scale exponentially. So our goal is to reach multi-megaton scale by 2030. We believe that this will be the basis for reaching gigaton scale by 2035. You can see our deployment plans here, where we're going from tens of thousands of tons of CO2 to 8 to 10 million tons by 2030. And if we can get to that trajectory, we're very, very confident that we can get to 1 billion tons by 2035. So thank you very much. Really enjoyed this. And just by virtue of being here, you've already joined us in the fight against climate change. Thank you.